Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. This is a great turnout for Scott. We're really excited. We normally don't have a June lecture, but we are today, so we're really fortunate. I want to welcome you all. My name is Pam Saltenberger. I'm the president of the Kingsley Art Club. And we have good news, and that is in August, September, October, and November, we have our lectures all set and ready to go. And August 16th, we have Lorraine Garcia Nakata, who's going to be here. September 20th, Alan Templeton. And I think many of you remember Alan from last year, and he's also going to do an individual tour of his new acquisitions. So that was a really wonderful lecture last year, and it'll be again this year. And then on October 18th, we have Peter Wayne Lewis, and some of his work is in the permanent collection of the Crocker. And then November 15th, we have Kurt Fishback. So we're really excited, and even though we're not telling you yet, we have starting our next year's speakers almost all lined up. So we're really excited about that. And just a quick little procedural thing. I'm sorry that things probably got a little carried away at the sign-in. The Crocker's installing a new procedure where you actually have to go online and register for anything that happens, including our lecture. It's free if you're a Kingsley member, and then you have to show that ticket to the front desk when you come. We're going to be trying to change that, but right now that's the procedure because it seems sort of convoluted to us too. But please bear with us, and we at least have the month of July to try to figure it out so it's not so difficult. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Cecilia Delury. Cecilia is the chair of our outreach, and now she's doing the Crocker Kingsley, and she's going to introduce Scott. Cecilia.
I'm shorter than everybody in the world, I think, especially since I lost 1 inch. So I don't spend much time at microphones anymore, but when I had this opportunity to introduce our speaker, Scott Shields, I just clutched the opportunity. Scott, and I bet most of you, I didn't till today, don't know what the A stands for, but if you notice, he always signs his name, Scott A. Shields, and it's ever present in anything printed about him. It's Alan. So new knowledge for today. Scott is going to be talking to us about California, the California Impressionism collection that has really been supported totally by my neighbors, actually, Melza and Ted Barr. So they have made me excited every time they have a new piece and arrive in Sacramento because they live in Houston and then say, we're on our way to the Crocker. So I know that I have to make my own way down here and see it because thanks to Scott, I have come to love the California Impressionist collection at the Crocker. So it's certain that all of you who are here today, the best crowd that we've had for a Kingsley speaker, we know that all of you love Scott, love listening to him, loving knowing his work, and having had the pleasure of seeing it and embracing it for the last 23 years. That's the amount of time Scott has been here. And you probably also don't know that he has done 80 exhibitions during the time here. And I've been thinking that could make a great Scrabble game. So without further ado, I am going to introduce Scott, and we hope you all buy the book on the exhibition, which is in the bookstore. And it has wonderful reproductions in there. Scott?
Thank you. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to give this talk. It's been a while since I've spoken to the Kingsley, and I appreciate how many of you turned out, and I will try to honor your time. It's a great topic of discussion, and it really came out of a book project that I did during COVID with the bars. And I'm going to start with all my plugs and get them out of the way. So this is the catalog, and it's California Impressionism at the Crocker Art Museum featuring the Melza and Ted Barr collection. But really, when we wrote this, it was really meant to be a history of California Impressionism broadly, not just what's at the Crocker. And the Crocker has most of the California Impressionists represented now, but not all of them. There's still a few on the list that maybe someday we will find. They don't just show up every time just because you want them to show up. But today, if you want a copy of this, today it's 10% off for everybody in this room, and this store has a little stash of them set aside. And then for Houghton, in our education department, I promised I would say that on July 8th, at 2 o'clock on Saturday, I'm talking about something completely different, which is Paul Warner and Theophilus Brown. So if you think you like modernism more than Impressionism, come to that one, because it's a little saucier too, probably. Because it's called Breaking the Rules. So I gave a version of this talk in Houston, actually, which was fun because people don't really know about California Impressionism unless you're from California, which is not really fair. And I think there was a lot of people in Houston that got very inspired about it after seeing the work. The thing about the California Impressionists is most of them weren't even from California. They were from all over the country. They were from different parts of the world. There were a few of them from California, and some of them were from California but went and worked elsewhere. It's really American Impressionism. Back when I was going to go to graduate school, I was an undergraduate studio major, and my favorite professor said, "I think you should go into art history." And I said, okay. And so I did. And then I went to talk to the head of the department at the University of Kansas. He said, well, what field do you want to study? Well, coming from a studio background, I didn't know much, and I thought, well, Impressionism sounds cliche. So I'll say American Impressionism, which here we are 30 years later. And it's essentially what I'm talking about. So I guess I guessed pretty well, but it really wasn't part of the plan. So the talk is called A Country of Blue and Gold, California Impressionism. And it came from this quote: most artists on coming here see too much local brown, which although it exists, does not exist in the paint. This is really a country of blue and gold. The fields and hills are yellow and orange in tone, thus making the shadows blue. The general public looks too much to subject in landscape, whereas the modern movement, subject means nothing. Line, color, and composition, everything. So California Impressionism didn't sort of evolve out of nowhere. So I want to start a little bit back and show you kind of how it got its beginnings. So here's one by Thomas Hill that's in the collection. It's called Picnic by the Sea from 1873. And Thomas Hill was an artist who was born in England. He trained and then worked in the East. He painted in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, and then ultimately made his way to California. Early on, he had a really tight representational approach, but as his career progressed, he became more influenced by the Barbizon painters in France, and also by the light of Impressionism that would start to happen. And you start to see the transition here. And this is looking towards where the Golden Gate is today. So you see Fort Point over there in the distance. That's where the Golden Gate Bridge would be. Can you imagine how wonderful a time it would have been to be in California at this moment? And then in the foreground, you have these picnickers with they're having wine. One of the backstories of this painting is that it was actually owned by Diane Disney Miller, who was Walt Disney's daughter. And she had a winery, and it hung in her winery, and that's what they're drinking in the foreground, with their Labradoodle, I think, which seems an odd dog for 1873, but there you go. Albert Bierstadt was another one that came. He was German-born and trained. He came to the United States. He came to California twice, once in the 1860s and again in the early 1870s for 3 years. We count him as a California artist, even though the East Coast counts him as an East Coast artist. Here he is in Oakland on a golden summer day near Oakland from 1873. And you can see again, the subject matter is becoming impressionist. You've got picnickers, which are always a big fan of impressionist painting. The light is starting to look impressionist, and the brushwork is starting to look impressionist. Bierstadt had a big influence on a lot of Californians because he was so famous in his day. Jules Tavernier is another one. He was from France. And you're seeing these people. So we've now had an Englishman, a German, and a Frenchman all ending up in California. Tavernier brought the Barbizon style to California. And the Barbizon painters worked outside of Paris near the forest of Fontainebleau. And they changed the style away from tightly rendered realistic depictions to scenes that were quieter, more in little patches of nature. The brushwork got looser, and Tavernier knew these paintings, and he brought this style to California. He ended up working in the Monterey Peninsula region, eventually got run out of Monterey because he owed too many people money and did some not so flattering illustrations of Monterey. Ended up in Northern California, had the same money troubles again, ended up then in Hawaii and became the first volcano painter in Hawaii. So the French consider him French, we consider him Californian, and the Hawaiians consider him Hawaiian. And then Raymond Dab Yelland. So this looks different, and it is. This is Golden Gate from Angel Island from 1884. Yelland was also born in England. He was born Raymond Dab. He later added Yelland to his name, and ended up in California. What he brought to the table was transcendentalism. So he was a big fan of the transcendentalist authors. He read Emerson and Thoreau. He was also an important teacher. And he taught so many students at the California School of Design in San Francisco, and he would read to them poetry of Emerson, his favorite author. And transcendentalism in art translates to the evocative qualities of light. And so you see the light in this landscape, it's almost like God is in that landscape. And that's what he's trying to communicate. And that also factors into the Californians that follow. Another thing he did with his students is he would take them outdoors to paint. So they would paint en plein air, which was an important change because before that, most artists did not. And generally what they would do is they'd go out with a small canvas and do an oil sketch on the spot. And then they'd come back and do the larger paintings in their studio because this painting is 28 by 48, so pretty good size. You know, wind comes up and you have a kite. And that doesn't work very well. So they mostly did the smaller works outside and the bigger works back in the studio. And then in the South, so Theodore Clement Steele was an Indiana artist, and he came to California to visit. And this is what he had to say. One can see Monets everywhere. The same color-charged air, the same scintillating radiance that Monet finds in the south of France, though with nobler forms and greater compositions than one usually finds in his pictures. I have no shadow of a doubt that someday there will develop a school of painters on this western coast that can fully interpret these great subjects and give the world a new and powerful school of art. And I think that that is very prescient of Theodore Clement Steele from Indiana to come out here and recognize what's to come and to see in the landscape Monet. And people were very versed by the 1890s in who Monet was. They were well aware of the French artists. And there were a lot of American Impressionists on the East Coast also pursuing Impressionism. Steele pursued his own variation of it. Now, there's a whole different take on Southern California at this same moment. And that is by this artist, Theophilus d'Estrella, who was Granville Redmond's teacher. He taught at the California School for the Deaf, and he was deaf himself. So he went to visit Redmond in Los Angeles, and he said, Los Angeles, with a population of about 125,000, is not the right kind of place for artists to make a comfortable living. There are two principal reasons. First, many of the Eastern visitors carry Kodaks with them, so they do not care to buy anything in art for more than $2. And secondly, many of the businessmen have brought treasures of art into their new residences from the East and Europe, and they are too absorbed in the pursuit of money-making to appreciate local art. So on one hand, you have this glorious setting, and on the other hand, you have nobody to support it. So there was not much going on in Southern California in the 19th century. San Francisco was the major city by far. You can see here, Southern California in 1898 was 125,000 people. So there was one small art school, there was no museums. It was really the wild, wild west. But there were a few people sort of making their mark down there. This is Alexander Harmer, who's considered one of the first Southern California artists and the first artist working in Santa Barbara. Mission San Juan Capistrano from 1886. And you're starting to see in this the color and light of Impressionism starting to creep in, but it's still a very tightly rendered painting. It doesn't have the broken brushwork that Impressionists are known for. But what I love about this scene, and it's a pretty recent acquisition from the past year, is that it shows different populations of California and the mission as it was in 1886. And this was a period when the missions had all fallen into disrepair. And it wasn't really until the early years of the 20th century and mid-20th century that they started to be repaired and preserved. Here's another one. This is Fanny Eliza Duval. This is confirmation class, San Juan Capistrano mission. 1886. So the same year as the one we just looked at. Fanny was considered one of the earliest of the California Impressionists in Southern California, but not totally. Some parts of her paintings are dark and some are tightly rendered. And then there's areas of light, as you see in these young ladies' dresses, that is pretty impressionist. Her work is super rare. We don't have anything in the collection. She's kind of on the radar, but I don't know if we will ever find one. Not many of them seem to have survived. And also for it to be a female painter in Southern California at this moment is also pretty rare. I will say, though, that you will see a lot of female artists in the works that are to come. And California had more than other parts of the country, more per capita female painters. And that was really because there was a lot more freedom out here to do what you wanted to do and to be who you wanted to be than there was on the East Coast. Just to take you ahead and jump you ahead, this is more what artists might have been doing in the early 20th century. So this is about 1928. This is Arthur Grover Ryder, and it's the bells at Mission San Juan Capistrano. So it's a totally different take on the mission. It's a much more impressionist take. Instead of showing the whole facade of the mission like the generations before might have, here he's focusing on the flowers and the bells and the fountains and more impressionist themes than would have happened before. And also the brushwork is a lot looser. And George Gardner Simons, this is in San Diego. This is a view from Point Loma in 1895. And in it is the Hotel del Coronado is right there, which was the biggest resort hotel in the world at the time. But there's not much else going on around it for San Diego at this period of time. And Simons was considered one of the first artists to work in San Diego. He came from the East Coast in the 1890s with his friend William Wendt, and we will look at William Wendt's work in a little bit. And they came multiple times in the 1890s, and then both ended up settling at least part of their time in Southern California. And then Paul de Longpre, this is Still Life with Bees. He worked almost entirely in watercolor, and he lived in Los Angeles. He planted, I want to say, 40,000 rose bushes that brought 25,000 visitors a year just to see his rose bushes. And then he painted them. And then I'm sure while they were there looking at his rose bushes, he sold a painting or two. And the ones with bees are always the most highly coveted. But it's not really Impressionism except for the light, because Impressionism is hard to do in watercolor. It's not impossible. But so that's another one that was working in Los Angeles before the turn of the last century. And in Northern California, you also had some early practitioners. This is Mary Curtis Richardson, who was way ahead of her time. So this is a portrait of Mary Blanche Hubbard from 1889. Mary Blanche Hubbard was married to Cyrus Hubbard, who was a mayor of Sacramento. And she was proud of her Greek profile. I know this because when I first started, her granddaughter came into the Crocker and showed me her profile, which was exactly like her grandmother. And she also said Grandma liked to make her own clothes. And Grandma liked her Greek profile so much, she portrayed herself as a Greek classical goddess. This is not an 1889 dress. There's no bustle. There's no big poofy sleeves. This is a very remarkable portrait. But for the artist, Mary Curtis Richardson, who is known as the Mary Cassatt of the West, It was a chance to really show off and also show off how learned she was. She knew the work of James McNeill Whistler. And if you look at Whistler's work here on the left, Whistler's famous for Whistler's mother, but he's really most famous for these white-on-white paintings of women. This one, I believe, is in the Frick, portrait of Mrs. Frances Leyland. And you can see she learned her lesson well. Richardson studied in New York City, so she probably knew Whistler's work firsthand. I can't point exactly to the moment when she saw it, but it's clear to me that she did at some point. And then she brought it to California, and specifically to Sacramento, which is pretty fun. This is Theodore Juarez, the iris flowers of Horikiri, Tokyo. Juarez is an American artist who started his career really painting in San Francisco's Chinatown. He lived near Chinatown. He became friends with the residents there. He taught art classes to Chinese residents. And then we have a painting upstairs of a Chinese restaurant. He then turned his attention to Japan, and he was the second American artist to spend significant time in Japan. You have to remember, Japan had been closed to the West for hundreds of years, and it wasn't until Commodore Perry came in 1854 and it became open, but it took a while for people to start going there. Juarez went twice. He went in the 1880s, and then he went again in the 1890s, and this one would be from the later period, because the first ones are tighter and darker, and then the second period, you can see he's had more impact of Impressionists, and what a perfect subject to paint, but a field of irises, and each one of those irises is almost picked out like pointillism. But you also see it didn't fall too far from what it actually looked like. This was a place where it was a gorgeous place to go paint, and he painted views of Japan off and on, and then he ended up going to Spain. He went to the Samoan Islands. He really was a traveler that worked all over the world painting different scenery. And then he ended up in Saratoga and retired there in California. Ernest Peixoto, Clarion by a Willow in San Rafael from 1893. Peixoto was, his nickname was Pinky Green, because he used a lot of pink and green. And he went to Giverny in France, which is where Monet had his studio. And so he was one of the earliest artists to spend significant time working in Giverny around Monet. A lot of people went there to sort of be touched by the proximity of Claude Monet. Most never really got to see them because Claude Monet didn't really much care to hang out with all the Americans that were going there. There were a couple exceptions to that. One of them became his son-in-law, but Peixoto was not that person. Peixoto then came back to the Bay Area. He ended up becoming known for his murals. If any of you have been to Filoli, the big murals at the Filoli are by Ernest Peixoto. But this is an early rare painting from 1893 of a California scene. And for a painting to be in California Impressionist in the 1890s, it's pretty early. And the Crocker has 3 of the earliest. And here's another one. This is Mary Brady's Sand Dunes in Monterey from 1895. Mary Brady had also gone to Giverny 3 times and worked there. She became friends with an artist named Theodore Robinson, who did this painting November on the lower left. And Theodore Robinson was quite a famous American Impressionist generally working in Giverny. But why that's important is that is Mary Brady in that painting. So they were pretty close. How close, I'm not really sure. Sometimes we just don't know because these things don't get written down. But then Brady comes back to California, and this is a scene of the sand dunes in Monterey, and such a modern painting for 1895 in California. It's modern really even by today's standards, but that is really full-blown light and color of Impressionism going on. Another one, a good friend of Mary Brady's, was Evelyn McCormick. And she was, Mary Evelyn McCormick was her full name, but she always went by Evelyn. And she studied, as many of the artists did, at the, abroad, and she worked alongside her boyfriend, who was Guy Rose, and we'll get to him. And then she came back eventually to California. This is one she did while she was in Giverny in 1891. And it's a garden, a pumpkin patch, in one of the back gardens of Giverny. I just think it's a gorgeous painting. So then she comes back to California, and we have this, which is Cactus Garden Del Monte. And these were also known as the Arizona Gardens, but they were at the Hotel Del Monte in Monterey, which is now the Naval Postgraduate School there. Those cactus gardens still exist, and they still pretty much look the same. Cactus grow really slow. But you see in this, it's Impressionism, but her brushstroke is still small. It's a tentative Impressionism. It's almost photoreal because the brushwork is so small. But she did this in 1893, 94, and she showed it in the 1894 Midwinter Fair in San Francisco. And so it makes it an important early work that we have in the collection. Later, not too much later, about 1900, she did this work, Monterey Bay. And you can see in the sky how much more impressionist her stroke has gotten. Her stroke has gotten bigger. She's gotten more bold. She never goes totally crazy because what she makes her reputation on ultimately is painting the historic architecture of the Monterey Peninsula. And then you can see, I just wanted to point out what it looked like then and what it looks like now. What a nice time it would have been to been in Monterey with real estate, which is cheap too. So here's part of the issue why there's not more Impressionism in Northern California. And it was this gentleman, Arthur Matthews, who was a wonderful artist, but he hated Impressionism. He was also a teacher and then the director of the California School of Design. So the Impressionism that was happening before, like McCormick, were by people that did not study with him, because basically he would, promote the students that painted in a tonalist style, which is what he's doing, and penalize those that painted in an Impressionist style. And so they didn't win prizes. So a lot of his students were more tonalists like him. And I always get, if I give a talk and I say tonalism, the first thing people ask is, what is tonalism? Tonalism is a style where all the colors are pretty close on the spectrum. It's very moody. It comes out of symbolism in France, and also tonalism in the East Coast. It's a national, international phenomenon that he participated in. It was influenced by Whistler, who we looked at with the one color on top of the one color. And then Matthews really promotes it here in California. And so by 1905, things start to get Matthews is starting to get a little criticism. So Laura Bride Powers of the San Francisco Call says, Matthews, he sees things in low tones and paints them very properly as he sees them. And being the potent and wholly worthy inspiration of the pupils, they too paint in low tones, whether they see it that way or not. And then another writer for the Argonaut said, if there's a San Francisco School of Painting, it is one that has grown up around Arthur Matthews and is recruited from his pupils. So they were starting to notice this, and they were noticing this enough in 1905 that Laura Bride Powers started to call for change in the art school, that she thought maybe we ought to have professors that were more open to different ideas. And so this was in 1905. That didn't have to go anywhere because this is what happened in 1906. It sort of made the point moot because the art school burned to the ground after the earthquake and fire in 1906. And you can see here, San Francisco was a real mess. So if there was to be a flowering of Impressionism in San Francisco, it was going to have to wait. And by the time it really got back to its old self, San Francisco in 1915, a lot of the big moment for Impressionism in California had passed. And really it was in 1915 when the Panama Pacific International Exposition happened that those artists who were not already pursuing it started to pursue it. But we'll get to that in a minute. But between Matthews and this earthquake, most of the Impressionism that we know of today really happened in the southern part of the state or in Monterey. So here's the exposition that I just mentioned. This is the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco, which was built by, it was a Bernard Maybeck building, built for the exposition. It was not meant to stay there. It was mostly made out of plaster. So the one that you can see today was rebuilt entirely because the other one wasn't meant to last. But people loved it so much that it got to stay. So this is Colin Campbell Cooper, who had not been to California before the fair. He was honored at the exposition in the big art show that happened there, and he came to paint. And then he loved California so much he ended up settling in Santa Barbara. But he was 60 years old when he came to California for the first time. This is E. Charlton Fortune, who was Euphemia Charlton Fortune, and this is Court of Flowers in the Court of the Universe at the PPIE. So one of the things artists could do when the exposition was going on is they could get a pass to go paint the exposition grounds. And Fortune immediately got her pass, and she went so she could paint the grounds. And you can see here the Court of Flowers and the Court of the Universe, and these two ladies in their umbrellas. There's one article or one chapter in a book on California Impressionism that's called The High Cost of Parasols, because it seemed like the more parasols were in the painting, the more costly the painting was. So this is Alexander Sterling Calder, which not an Impressionist painting, but of the moment. This is a Star Maiden from 1914. So this was made for the Court of the Universe at the Panama Pacific International Exposition. For those of you that are wondering, there was generations of Calder sculptors. So there was Alexander Milne Calder, Alexander Sterling Calder, and then Alexander Sterling Calder's son, Alexander Calder, who made the mobiles. So there's a long history. And Sterling Calder ended up working in California on multiple occasions, but he became the director of the sculpture program at the exposition. And you can see here, those are where the Star Maidens are. You see them all standing up there. There were 94 of them or 96 of them, I can't remember. Calder also did the sculptures on the top of the arch. These two sculptures are by a guy named Adolf Weinman. It was a fabulous, fabulous fair, and hundreds of thousands of people came, and thousands and thousands and thousands of works of art were shown, including Impressionists from all over the country and some from all over the world. And even more modern things like Futurism was shown at this exposition, which really boggled people's minds in California, the Italian Futurists. But after the fair, it changed people's perceptions. And so Anthony Anderson, who was one of the most important art critics of the Los Angeles Times, said there was a time when artists thought they could paint without light and when air was hardly considered. But that time seems prehistoric to us now, but it was really only a few years ago. Today, the search for light and air is pursued with enthusiasm, and we refuse to consider seriously the picture that is without them. So, right around the time of the fair, you get a lot of works that are Impressionists. Some of the younger artists were already doing it, and those that weren't already doing it started doing it almost immediately thereafter. This is Bruce Nelson, who was one of the younger artists at Monterey Bay. Bruce Nelson, not much is known about Bruce Nelson. He did these beautiful paintings. He attended Stanford. He went to school for engineering and architecture, but ended up transferring to art and did a series of paintings of California, and then ended up in the military, and then ended up in the East Coast, and we could sort of lose track of him after that. We do know that there was a show later where he did a lot of winter scenes of the East Coast, and then must have been quite a contrast with these beautiful, glorious blue and gold paintings that he did of California. This is Lover's Point in Pacific Grove, right there. William Ritchell, The In-Stealing Fog from 1916. Ritchell, there's a school of Monterey Peninsula painters in particular that worked in a style that's sort of Impressionism, but it's sort of not Impressionism. They're using Impressionist brushwork and sometimes color, but there's this power. And these paintings are all being done right around the years of World War I. And I think that there's kind of a parallel or metaphor being made between the two forces. There's this sort of force of the waves versus the force of the strength of the coast. And a lot of artists were doing these right about the same moment that the United States was entering World War I. Here's another one. Edgar Payne's doing the same thing. He's doing it in Southern California. He worked down in the Laguna Beach area and was one of the founders of the Laguna Beach Art Association. And he did it, but he goes on to do many other things. Jack Wilkinson Smith did it, California Coast, that beautiful spray in the background. So a lot of artists up and down the coast, not so much in San Francisco at this moment, but mostly Monterey and farther south. So while some artists are focusing on the sea, other artists are focusing on flowers, and what flower better to focus on than the California poppy? I mean, we're blessed with this abundantly beautiful orange flower that sometimes contrasts very perfectly in art because it's a complement with the blue-purple lupins. And so artists made use of this. Anthony Anderson again said, amethyst mountains were close at hand. The poppy fields were flung like golden carpets. The opal sea of Laguna Beach sparkled within easy distance, and nature counts none but sunny hours. So it's boosterism. And really, artists were drawn to California in large part because they could work outside for much of the year and most days, whereas it wasn't the case in a lot of other states. Granville Redmond became the foremost painter of California poppies, but this is a perfect example of what's tonalism, what's Impressionism. Granville Redmond studied at the California School of Design in San Francisco. Arthur Matthews was his teacher. Redmond was also, he became deaf at age 3, which made him really an interesting artist to follow, because that was not a time when it was so easy to be a deaf student and go to Paris and then study in San Francisco. But his talent was such that people really helped him along. Here you have a very tonalist painting with this patch of Impressionism thrown into the middle of it. But he prefers this himself, but this is not what the general public comes to want. So he starts to do poppies and more color. And here's one that's kind of later on in his career, and then you get ones like this, which is Field of Poppies. And that brushwork and the light and the color is just pure Impressionism. He says, because of his deafness, he said, I prefer to paint pictures of solitude and silence. But he says, but alas, everybody wants poppies. And he was the best, but he was not the only. So John Marshall Gamble is another one that made his career painting poppies and pairing it with blue lupins and other kinds of ceanothus and flowers like that. And so this is one of Gamble's works. Gamble was in San Francisco until the earthquake and fire of 1906, and then moved to Santa Barbara and pursued the rest of his career there. Percy Gray, who was a watercolorist. And this is Impressionist watercolor, if you can have that. And it's Lupin in Kern County. Percy Gray was also a student in Northern California, though, and so you have a good part of this is very tonal, mixing with some Impressionist flowers in the foreground. William Franklin Jackson, Poppy Field on the Bay. Some of you will recognize Jackson because he was from Sacramento. He started out painting the Sierra, and then ultimately turned to painting a lot of scenes of poppy and lupin and Northern California scenes. He was lured to the Crocker to be the first curator by Margaret Crocker herself. Basically, she would not take no for an answer. He taught art school in the ballroom, and he was the curator here for 50 years. I'm now 23. I've done the math. It's not happening. Not. Tournament of Roses Parade, Pasadena. So, this is the perfect time to be a flower painter in Southern California. The Tournament of Roses starts at this period of time, and flowers, what California is becoming known for. It's interesting, though, if you go back to the generation before the Impressionists, almost no Californian really focused on painting the wildflowers, which seems kind of crazy that you would go and you paint all these landscapes, but nobody paints wildflowers, because wildflowers at that time were not a subject that was paintable. It took the Impressionists to make that a subject. But it made sense once you ended up in Southern California. And here is a quote about Pasadena by Edwin Markham. From 1,000 orange groves blows the bridal odor that breathed over Eden. Jasmine, honeysuckle, heliotrope, wisteria, roses of every name and fame all begin to billow and surge over porches and gates and roofs, down streets and roads in a glory of perfume and color. And here's one of those places. So this is the Joyous Garden. This is in Pasadena. It's by Benjamin Chambers Brown, who earned the nickname Poppy Brown because he painted a fair number of flowers. Most of his scenes, though, are out in the middle of nature, not so much in a domestic setting such as this one. But this is a beautiful painting. I think it's the best one he ever did. The secret story about this is this used to be owned by the Irvine Museum. And I said to the curator, I said, if you guys are ever getting rid of that painting, I hope you'll tell me, oh, we're never going to get rid of that painting, Scott. And then he retired, and then the museum partnered with another museum, and then some of the things were still in the Irvine family's collection, and this one did get sold, and thank God the Bars were able to help us get it. Because it's a major work. This is Franz Bischoff. red and white roses face. So Bischoff was born in Austria. He came to New York, he ended up in Detroit, and then in Dearborn, Michigan. He taught China painting. China painting, which probably a lot of you had grandmothers or great-grandmothers that might have been China painters. And China painting was a big deal. He was considered the best in the whole country, if not the whole world. And he ended up coming to California and settling in Pasadena, and his name was the King of the Rose Painters. So if you settle in Pasadena as the King of the Rose Painters, you're just kind of like guaranteed a future. But he then turns his attention away from China painting over time to start painting paintings. And he started by painting the flowers that he knew so well. And this is one of roses. But then he starts to turn his attention to the landscape itself. The Arroyo Seco of Pasadena from about 1918, which you're seeing the color and light of Impressionism. And then this one, which was a gift to us recently, called Cambria, a peaceful California village, which is a really lovely and important painting. So thrilled that we have, but unusual to see this whole town, a whole Impressionist town really is what you're seeing here. Anthony Anderson was the great booster of the Impressionists in California and wrote about them a lot. And he says, nature has been magnificently and prodigally kind to us out here. We have everything in landscape the eye could wish for, and we have transcendent beauty whenever we turn to look for it. 2, the climactic conditions are ideal for the landscape painter, 365 working days, or nearly so many. William Wendt, German-born, he was the one that came with Simons in the 19th century to California, and he continued to return. He ultimately settled in Los Angeles, and then he bought a plot of land in Laguna Beach. He was married to a sculptor named Julia Brackenwendt, and she ended up staying pretty much in Los Angeles where she taught, and he ended up staying pretty much in Laguna Beach. But this is a transitional painting for him. Early on, he was really impressionist. Later on, he becomes more of a modernist. His work becomes more blocky and powerful. One art critic says, I thought I saw the lessons of the Cubist in his skies and trees. And I think you see the lessons of the Cubist in those skies and trees. This is Elmer Wachtell, Monrovia Canyon. Elmer Wachtell ended up in California pretty early on, was one of the first painters. He was a violinist, and he painted scenes of the canyons and eucalyptus of Southern California. The eucalyptus is important in the paintings enough that there was a school called the Eucalyptus School, which was sort of a derogatory term because so many artists painted the eucalyptus, which were not native. They were planted because they thought they might solve the hardwood shortage, and they were not good for building. So, but they were beautiful, and they're a fire risk now. Yeah, so it's, but a lot of artists painted them, so it kind of gave coin to the Eucalyptus School. This is Marion Cavanaugh Wachtell, who is married to Elmer, who we just looked at, and it's called In the Shadows of the Mountains. Early on, Marion was a watercolorist and a tonalist, and she focused mostly on watercolor. And most of the writers have written about her say that she did that to avoid competition with her husband. And that happened to a fair degree. But she did start to paint oils before he died, and she painted a lot of oils after he died. And so here's one of Mount Whitney from Lone Pine. Guy Rose, Laguna Trees. Guy Rose was the most impressionist of the California Impressionists, and one of the very most important. I'd say he's in the top 1 or 2. And he was in Giverny on multiple occasions. He knew Monet. He bought a house in Giverny. He lived there from 1904 to 1912 in this cottage that he built, and he had lived there prior. But Guy Rose really brought a really French touch to California landscape, and you can see the influence of Monet in scenes like this one of Laguna Trees. Here's one of off Mission Point, Point Lobos. So he went from doing a lot of scenes in Giverny to scenes around Los Angeles and Laguna Beach, but also later in life, he worked in the Monterey Peninsula region where this one is from. Unfortunately, he did not live very long because he suffered from lead poisoning. And so he had through whole periods of his career where he couldn't really work at all. And then it caused his early death. And so whereas other artists might have moved on to something else, he never really had the chance because he passed in 1925, which was a shame because he was an immensely skilled artist. Here's one of Monterey Cypress from circa 1918. And as I said before, he was the boyfriend for quite a while of Evelyn McCormick. But then the long story short is his father was a California state senator, and she was this bohemian young woman, and she ended up in Monterey, and he ended up down in Southern California, and his parents didn't like her, I don't think. And so they split up, which was unfortunate for both. But he found another partner. John Frost, San Gabriel Valley from 1923. John Frost was an informal student of Guy Rose and paints a lot like Guy Rose. He suffered from tuberculosis. A lot of artists at this time suffered from tuberculosis, and part of the reason that so many of them ended up in California was because the climate was better for that. And so he lived in the desert for a lot of his career, and that dry air was supposed to be better for your health if you had tuberculosis. But he ended up dying pretty early too. But this San Gabriel Valley, this is transcendentalism in the landscape. This is like God blessing the land, really, where probably today there's a big old strip mall. But at the time, I mean, imagine how wonderful that would have been to be there. This is John Frost at Santa Monica Beach. He went with an artist to Santa Monica Beach, another artist named Alison Clark, who I'll show you in a minute, and painted the beach activities. But that light, that bright, glaring white light is so very Southern California. And then in the back you have the Santa Monica Pier and this new pleasure pier, which had just been built a couple of years before with a carousel, and then the people under their umbrellas. Carl Jens ended up working in the Laguna area. Laguna develops its own very important art colony in the 19-teens. It had been a little bit difficult to get there because before you had to try to get to, and you had to take a train there, and then you had to take a stage across, and by the time you get there, you were exhausted, but it was worth it. But then eventually, a road was built, which made it a lot easier to get to Laguna, and a lot more artists would come there. This Arch Beach Tavern, which I'm told still exists, was built to do two things. One, people from the motion picture industry worked out of there, but they also sold lots out of there. This area where this is in the Laguna Hills, which at the time they couldn't sell the lots because it was too inaccessible to get up into them. And so you could have had a lot in Laguna Hills for like $50. So yeah, don't you wish you could go back in time and buy them all? This is Allison Skinner Clark, the Weekend Mission Beach. Clark was the one that was good friends with John Frost, and this he's doing down around San Diego. So California was the most motorized city, or not California, but Los Angeles was the most motorized city in the world. There was one car for every 3 people, which is a lot of cars for this period of time. And people would go on their little trips, but they wouldn't just go for the afternoon, they would usually stay. So these are campers on the beach. You'd set up your tent for the day and camp out by the beach, and you'd make a weekend out of it. But painters, the car was really important for them down there, and they would travel, to and from San Diego to Laguna, all around the region to paint and find subject matter. And some would travel up into the Sierra. This is Maurice Braun. So he worked down around San Diego, and this is called Foothills from 1934. And he was a theosophist. And he settled in San Diego because the Point Loma Theosophical Society was there. And he credited them with sharpening insights into nature and really the interconnectedness of the universe. And that's what he's trying to communicate. You don't really understand bronze paintings until you spend some time down in San Diego. And the San Diego region looks exactly like that. But I didn't get it until I really went down there. I thought he was making it up. Sam Hyde Harris, Fish Harbor, San Pedro. Harris was another artist working down there. This, because you see the date on this, 1935, this is moving into the period of, the Great Depression era, the WPA era. People are starting to focus more on the activities of humans. These fishing boats, motorized fishing boats and things up here, not really a subject that the most Impressionists would have favored. They really would have favored scenes from an era with showing no people or people working in harmony with nature, not exploiting it quite in the way that Harris is showing here. There's also a group of artists that do figure painting, and that's really not the specialization of most Californians. Most Californians found that landscape paintings sold better, and they found them less hard to paint, and so they tended to focus on landscape more than they focused on people. But there was a thread of people painting going on, and when people were painted, they were usually women. Male portraits a lot, but usually if it's just a genre scene of, scene of life, it's almost always a woman. This is Guy Rose Jade Beads. There was a big movement at the time called the dress reform movement, where the kimono and Chinese robes were championed as a comfortable, fashionable alternative to corseted attire. And they didn't wear them correctly. They didn't wear them with the obi. They're sort of loose like a house coat. But they thought that both the women and the artists and the people that looked at the paintings thought that this was, a really good way to show how cultured and tasteful you were. And if you can match your interior, all the better. And here's one that did that, Richard Miller, her dressing table. And that the idea of the harmony between the interior setting, the clothing is all there. And yet the woman doesn't look particularly happy. She's gazing at her reflection twice. She's got her hand mirror, she's got her mirror. And that is often the case, that there's these sort of evocations of women in a gilded cage, for lack of a better description. Here's another woman that doesn't look particularly happy. It's called Daydreams. It's by John Hubbard Rich. And that light and color out the window and the yellow shoes and that hat, but she's got great attitude, and that's part of the reason we really like this painting. Another secret is that the paint of the gallery upstairs is the yellow color, was based on her shoes. This is Joseph Kleitsch, who was Hungarian, ended up coming and settling in Chicago after moving around a lot. He painted this painting in Chicago. This is a portrait of Mrs. K, who is Mrs. Kleitsch. There's a whole show of Joseph Kleitsch opens this weekend in Laguna, and this painting is there, so you can't see it right now. But if you talk about the use of light and how, the French, it's always talked about how light dissolves the subject. It's literally almost dissolving her. And he brought this style to California. And this is a California scene. And so that's Mrs. K again. And this is Florence Marsh. And they are in Florence Marsh's antique shop, which was in the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. And this painting is one of my favorites because it's not easy to put red and orange together as an artist and make it work. And he has just got one complementary tone up against another, and it's just like a kaleidoscope. And this painting is also in Laguna. So if you get down there, stop by and see them and say hi. This is Donna Schuster. So I don't want you to think it's only men that paint women. A lot of women painted women. And so this is Donna Schuster, Garden Reflection. She was one of the modern artists of Southern California. This is Anne Bremer, The White Dress. She was from the northern part of the state, and she began again as a tonalist, but then sort of branched out into Impressionism. She unfortunately didn't live very long, but did works like this. Women in white dresses was a very popular subject going back to Whistler, but it was also part of the Boston School of Painters. Tarbell was one of them. And some of these artists studied directly. Rich studied directly with the Boston painters. Schuster studied with the Boston painters. And then Helena Dunlap, young Danish girl with flowers. So she started out as an Impressionist, but then became a modernist. So depending on when you were born, she became early on known for works like these, but later on becomes much more modern and much more abstract. And then finally, Post-Impressionism. So Post-Impressionism is really just an art historical term that's meaningless. It just means after Impressionism. But it sort of does define this generation of this new group of artists who go a little bit beyond where the Impressionists had gone. Joseph Raphael, who was from California, he was from California, but he ended up going abroad, and he stayed abroad. And he worked out in a town called Uccle in Belgium, and he looked at people like Cezanne, he looked at Van Gogh, and he applied their brushstrokes to his own work. And this is a cabbage field. But it's really about paint. And if you look at this painting, it's just got these thick, I call them attention-seeking brushstrokes, because they really are trying to get your attention more than the subject. E. Charlton Fortune, Feeding Time Monterey. And she was truly an Impressionist, but she starts to move into Post-Impressionist realms, and she's starting to do so here. And here, this is California landscape. So this is at the mouth of the Carmel Valley. And you could see how painterly she's getting. And she taught as well, and so she had some influence on some students, including a group called the Society of Six were influenced by her, and I'll show you some of them. Later, Fortune leaves California and spends a couple of years in England working in St. Ives, and then she goes to Saint-Tropez, which is where this is. This is called Wine Cargoes from 1925. And it's really, it's got Impressionism in there, but it also has a little Cubism, has some Cézanne, and a lot of bold modernist color. And she saw their work firsthand. She'd been abroad. She was very, well-versed in modernism in Europe. Armin Hansen sort of evolves the same way. So this is his Kitty in the Blue Wagon, which is a truly Impressionist painting of the Monterey region. And for a long time it was called the Farmhouse, but I found a newspaper article that described it as Kitty in the Blue Wagon. And Kitty is the horse. Then he starts to do work around the Monterey Peninsula area. And at this time, Monterey was becoming known for its sardine fisheries and the canneries, and all these fisher folk were there, and he paints them and becomes known for this. This is unusual because these are sharks, and they're big ones. He also did work of the Salinas Rodeo, and so this is Spirit of the Rodeo. In the 1920s, he kind of, especially after the Depression, he fell on hard times, and he started to diversify his subject matter, and this is a very modern depiction of the rodeo by Armin Hansen. Clarence Hinkle, who was from not too far from Sacramento, he studied with William F. Jackson in the Crocker Ballroom. And then he went off and studied in Europe eventually and learned the Cézanne, he learned Van Gogh, and he brought that back to California and then ended up working in the Southern California region, doing scenes of Laguna Beach and the desert, like this one. And then this one is overlooking Laguna, which is a recent gift to us by Clarence Hinkle from, I think, Auburn or Lincoln? Auburn. And then Charles Rifle, Spring. This is Charles Rifle painting down around San Diego, and Rifle was one of the artists that worked there. This is Rifle splitting wood himself, so it's a self-portrait of sorts, but that brushwork is past Impressionism now and moving into the next thing. And then finally, this group of artists, the Society of Six. Society of Six were a group of Oakland artists. They had seen the work at the Panama Pacific International Exposition, and 2 years later, they started a group. The group was started by Selden Guile and August Gay, and then it was really promoted by this artist, William Clapp, who also happened to be a curator at the Oakland Art Gallery, which makes it nice. So you have today I couldn't do a show of my friends like he did, but he did. And so this is Monday Wash, and he really was the most impressionist of the Society of Six, but also post-impressionist. This is really like pointillism, which is that ... that Seurat started. Here's Selden Guile, and this is also very post-impressionist and Fauvist. So they're moving into realms that are even beyond post-impressionism. The Fauvists were people centered around Matisse, Henri Matisse, and Fauvism means wild beast, and they were given that name because of the wildness of their color. And that's what they start applying to California. Here's a really progressive work by Selden Guile called Cows and Pasture, which is a small painting, but a very influential one. If you look at this, and then you think about the next generation, almost 2 generations later, people like Richard Diebenkorn and David Park and Elmer Bischoff, even Paul Warner and Theophilus Brown, that is who they're looking at as early Selden Guile. And this is probably from around 1920. So very progressive for its era. Here's August Gay, Old Chinatown and Pacific Grove. He came from France. He was in a poor family, and rather than stay with his poor family, he moved in with Selden Guile, and together they founded this art movement. He later moved to Monterey Peninsula, trained with Armin Hansen, but they were influencing each other. And Armin Hansen, who we just looked at, said, I looked over the shoulder of August Gay, and I could see all the modern masters in one painting. And so it was kind of a reciprocal influence in their case. This is Maurice Logan, Houses and Beachgoers along Belvedere. We don't have a good Society of Six painting by Maurice Logan, so he's on our list. We'll see if we can find one. Louis Siegrist, another member of the Six. This is Old Warehouse Sausalito. This is a recent gift from Yvonne Bosker, and you can see how thick that paint is. Really wonderful modernist abstraction. It doesn't really matter that it's an old warehouse because you really can't tell, but it's just a lovely painting. And then Bernard von Eichmann, who we do not have, is super hard to get. This is China street scene. Von Eichmann destroyed most of his own paintings, so there aren't very many of them out there. But you can see how very modern he was and how far we are now past Impressionism. And this was the manifesto of the Society of Six that they wrote in 1925. And they said, to us, seeing is the greatest joy of existence, and we try to express that joy. We have much to express, but we have nothing to say. We have felt and desire that others might also feel. So what they're saying is they're trying to communicate on this visceral level. But I love this idea that seeing is the greatest joy of existence. And I think that was true all along for all the artists we just looked at. It just evolved over time. And each generation thinks they're telling the truth about what they're seeing, but that truth changes from generation to generation. So with that, thank you very much. And if any of you still have time on your meters, I'm happy to take a couple of questions.
Questions?
I see one back there. Can you?
We're talking about the precursors of the Impressionists. You talked about Thomas Hill and Albert Bierstadt. Did Thomas Moran play into that at all?
If he had spent more time in California, I would say yes. But there's less of a direct one-to-one connection because he didn't spend most of his time here. He was here a little bit, but not with the kind of same influence that Hill and Bierstadt and Keith had, probably.
Thank you.
Yeah.
How many of the photos or paintings are in our galleries?
You know, I would say probably about 3/4.
Yeah. I recognize many of them.
Yeah, I wanted you to see paintings you knew. If I was missing somebody, I threw somebody else and then threw a new work in, and sometimes I would include a different work just to make a point that we are unable to make in our own collection, but I tried to focus on things that we own that you would know.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Nobody else? Wow, okay. The books are on sale in the store. So thank you again for coming. I really appreciate it.